the movie still succeeds. I still love it. It called my bluff. There was multiple times I was like, if this gets any more corny, I'm out. And then it would get more corny and I was still in.
Hello, and welcome to a Loyalty Cup discussion. We typically give our general impressions before jumping into spoilers. But first, I'm Richie.
I'm Mandy.
I'm Sean.
Andy, what's this movie about?
Ooh.
Mandy is a 2018 psychological thriller directed by Panos Cosmatos. Set in 1980s California, Nicolas Cage plays Red, a logger who loses his wife to a violent spiritualist cult. This leads Red on a murderous revenge path that is paved with evil demons, LSD, and larger-than-life battle sequences.
Yeah, I love this film. I love Nicolas Cage. He's a national treasure. Andy, would you agree?
I agree.
It was gorgeous, looked great, sounded great. The sound design was incredible, and the soundtrack was also just wonderful. I loved it. I was really waiting for it to be super corny and overdone, and it never really went over the top with that. Everything else
toes the line, but
yeah.
It's like just enough to where you're in it.
Yeah, didn't take me out of it. I loved it.
This is a really fantastic movie. I think honestly it's a masterpiece. It's something that is an auditory and visual experience like I don't think anything I've ever had in the theater before. It's not quite for everybody. You have to be ready for that experience. And for me, it was something I was absolutely ready for, and I loved it. Andy, how do you feel on this thing?
I loved it. I was actually pleasantly surprised by it. I agree with everything you guys both said. There are many instances where it starts to approach absurd fantasy, but then it kind of stops just before it goes over that line. I think when the movie ended, I told you, I'm like, oh, that was a piece of art. Like, I think a lot of mainstream movie audiences may not walk out with the same experience we did, but if you're into thrillers or actions or art movies at all, this is a gorgeously filmed movie, well produced. Everything has intent, and it looks great.
And with that, let's jump into spoilers. Typically after the jump, we like to remind people to please subscribe, so clicky-clack the button right there. I'm pointing at somewhere around here is a button. There are some things in this movie that could come off as kind of cryptic, and while I don't think the discussion really benefits a lot from diving deep into it and getting into the weeds of some of this stuff, we will try to orient you on some things, some questions some people might come out of, despite a lot of this stuff being really in the text. So we'll go through it one by one. Sean, who are the Black Skulls?
What they are, actually, what the movie says they are, is a bunch of biker LSD couriers who got a bad dose and never came back.
What were the illustrations?
In the movie, what it actually is just dream sequences.
Mm-hmm. And they are things that Mandy was reading from that book she was reading.
Right, and so there is this kind of, if they're Red's dreams, how does he know what she was reading, you know? Mm-hmm. Is it some type of connection to her through his subconscious? Mm-hmm. I don't know.
All right, we're going to shoot this to Andy. What was the gray goop?
The gray goop was a batch of LSD that was either too strong or poisoned or something that they gave to the religious sect.
Maybe.
It does like speak to how it hints at the supernatural, like he was just called to this jar. Despite, like, does it smell good? Does it smell like cookies?
You do have to just take the ride. You know, and that's why we don't want to go into a full-on, because I don't think there is a definitive answer for a lot of this stuff. It's just kind of, you've got to, when we do this in other movies, when we talk about it, it's just we kind of create these connections for ourselves to enjoy the movie more, not necessarily to take away from it. So my perception of that goop was, that there is some type of supernatural draw to it, and that it gave him that extra boost to really go berserk and to have the endurance and the bloodlust to go after these people. And I loved it.
You know, the whole movie, they portray Red as a regular guy. He's a logger with a regular job. He drinks liquor to kill his pain, but then at the point when he decides he has to take on these demons and these crazy religious sect, he has to get on their level. So he takes a taste of the LSD, and then it brings it up, and he's able to battle these creatures.
He actually turns down booze in the helicopter. If you'll remember, when they pick him up from work with the helicopter, the guy offers him a beer. He says no thanks.
He also looks super disappointed that it would have been offered to him in the first place.
He looks disgusted.
Yeah.
But I think that says something. I think we're shown Mandy has created a new Red, and that he puts this stuff that's old, and so maybe he is disgusted by the beer and that. And so when he loses Mandy, what does he do? He pounds the liquor that he has stashed in the bathroom.
Hidden in the bathroom.
Hidden. So that was probably there for that reason. You know, if everything just falls apart, he has it out of his normal line of sight. It's not in his day-to-day life, but it's there for when he needs it.
And it was a pretty full bottle too, which indicated he hadn't previously done this.
But then what does he do after that? He immediately goes to another person and he has things hidden with another guy, the crossbow. Maybe he was just a nut and he had to get rid of the crossbow because of what he might do to a man. Yeah, so he gets his crossbow, snorts a huge pile of coke
off a shard of glass,
starts licking goo. You know, this is a new Red that we're seeing.
And the last thing is the axe. Andy, what did we know about the axe?
Well, when I saw the trailer, I thought I was going to hate it, but the axe, it comes out of necessity. You know, he realizes he has to battle these demons, and so he needs a weapon to take them on. So all of a sudden it cuts to him in a forge or a forgery, melting steel, pouring an axe, and then pounding it down to this battle axe that he uses for the rest of the film.
There isn't necessarily just like with the Great Goop, there isn't necessarily a definitive explanation for it. It's just in there.
It's a sequence of him just pounding metal and sharpening an axe.
Yeah, and it really worked for me. I know you had some problems with it, Sean.
I hated the axe. I've said it before that there are moments in this movie that I was so involved in and immersed in the experience that I was just waiting for something to take me out of it. And like we were saying earlier, it does kind of toe the line between seriousness and just kind of being corny. At that point with the axe, I hated the axe. I thought it was super corny. I thought it was just silly looking. When you're flirting with heavy metal motifs, that certain ones, I mean, I don't necessarily think stand up to criticism, and just tribal shaped axes just really are just beyond corny for me. I hated it. The movie still succeeds. I still love it. It called my bluff. There were multiple times I was like, if this gets any more corny, I'm out. And then it would get more corny and I was still in.
I think in any other thriller or standard horror movie it would stick out, but because this becomes a fantasy and you have elements of planetary closeness, like they show these, they almost look like sunsets, but there's like 1 or 2 or 3 planets very close to the Earth. Between that and these LSD demon figures, you're not in our base reality. You're in some kind of psychological thriller from the 80s. It's all...
I think it was beautiful because it was bold, right? Because it could have been a sword and that'd have been like, oh, that's kind of cheesy. But they went like whole hog on a tribal axe.
And you're right. And I'm not mad at there being an axe. Really, I guess it just comes down to aesthetics. I mean, I hated the design of the axe. I thought it was just so stupid looking. It looked like it should have had flames like etched onto it or something. It was whack.
It's one of those where it's like if your friend invited you over and you were like, dude, you got to check out this thing I got. And you'd be like, wow, that's really lame. Like you spent a lot of money on something really stupid.
It looked like a flea market axe. Like it has its own stand that's made out of garbage wood.
There's 2 things that happen with the axe that I really liked. One, when you think he's about to use it, it's taken away from him. And so it builds this tension of like, well, why did we see the whole forging scene if he doesn't get to use the axe? But then when he does use the axe, you get this awesome insert of it just flipping for like half a second and then hitting that guy. It's so great. So I really want to dive into the visuals of this movie because this movie is, I think, first and foremost, a visual experience. You sit down and from the first shot, when you see that noisy grain and whatever film stock they're using to turn all the blues so teal, see that like ultra wide perspective on the screen, it's mind-blowing. It looks beautiful.
It is a type of filmmaking that I haven't seen in a long time, and I was just floored by it. I was totally into the experience. Certain things just complemented the hallucinatory aspect of the story.
I'd say the one scene that really stuck out to me was after they captured Mandy and they drugged her. Jeremiah was dancing and playing his music for her, and they showed his face for, it must have been 5 minutes, while he just spoke to her. And occasionally, for about 15 or 30 seconds at a time, it would merge Mandy's face into his as he spoke. And it was kind of only indicated by the birthmark or the scar on her face. And then once you realized what was happening, it dissolved so seamlessly that you really felt like you were in this weird transcendental space with the character.
So when you see Mandy walking down the street and...
That's the part I wanted to talk about.
The Colt is driving past her. That whole scene was incredible to me. It might be one of my favorites of the whole film, is when it just locks onto Mandy as they're passing through and just freezes that blurred, super saturated, just still of her.
Well, and before it does that, it does cut backwards in time just a half second and plays the clip again, and then backwards again, and then he does it twice. Like the fact that he thought, I'm gonna show this 3 times over, and then on the last one just let it linger, and her eyes end up on the top right of the screen and just fades, but it feels like the fade takes like 10 to 15 seconds. It felt like a nightmare.
I loved it.
It was awesome.
Yeah, that was if you could distill this movie down in just a one still, it's that one.
It's interesting because Mandy doesn't necessarily show you anything that as if she is this spiritual figure or anything special, except that the filmmaking makes her feel ultra real, like supernatural in some way. And that is one of the moments where it does that. Also the scene where the faces meld together, I think, is one of them. And I also think the illustrations lends to that.
The sound does just as much to create this immersion into just hallucinations. Just voices slowing down, becoming just a low rumble.
Tonally shifting down.
When they're out in the woods and they slam the van door and just that reverb echoes out into the forest. It's awesome. Johan Johansson, his soundtrack is incredible.
It's so good.
One of the best I've heard in years. It also has guest appearance by Stephen O'Malley from Sun when they're walking through that church, just that droning guitar. Everything is so complimentary in the film.
Well, it all works and locks together in such a way to really make something more than the sum of its parts.
Especially once Mandy is murdered and Red goes on this rampage, the filmmaking supports that in such a fantastic way. The movie gets darker. Like every time you see Red, it almost looks like it's a stop or two underexposed, and you only see the highlights of his acts or the highlights of the blood coated on his face. And near the end of the movie is getting deeper and deeper into this underground layer or pit. It becomes so dark on the scenes of him that you really feel as a viewer that he's becoming one of these demons or one of these psychopaths.
With the music, one thing that I noticed, I loved all the synthy sounds kind of intermingling with this industrial sort of noise that would come together. It was super visceral, and it added to the visuals in such a fantastic way. But some of my favorite parts of the soundtrack were parts that felt like they really did belong in a fantasy movie, not just like a horror movie, not a action thriller. Like it felt like it belonged into a movie where I was transported into some magical world. I did listen to the soundtrack afterwards, and it was like Mandy's love theme that would twinkle and like would have these like, I don't know if it was like an organ, but whatever the melody was really did feel like I was inside of the cover of one of these 80s, horror novels.
And that's what it does so well too, is just blending so many different, just inspirations, into one thing.
Well, like the title cards.
The title cards were sick.
Beautiful design.
I think the first one was Shadow Mountain. And for like a split second, I thought I was in the wrong theater. And I thought, I'm like, oh, am I seeing a movie called Shadow Mountain? But they're just...
That's another thing too, is if you only saw Mandy, this isn't going to make much sense. Go back, see the other 2 installments. It's going to be a much stronger experience.
You could theoretically get there 45 minutes late and then see the Mandy logo and think you're watching.
If you're just a raw dude and you got no time for any BS, show up around the halfway mark and you'll be fine.
One other visual too that I really loved, that I actually think was genius in its simplicity, at least the way that I think it happened, was like at the very end where Nick Cage is looking over at the empty seat, and I think to get the effect all they did was put on like a light above the camera, but because it looked like a bad flash on your iPhone or something, it just felt like you were in the car. And just having Nick Cage stare dead into the camera with like a crazy face was like, oh my god. And then it panned over and there was Mandy, and she also looked insane with the light over her. Then it panned back to him with a big old grin,
and he looks more insane.
Oh my god. It was, again, it felt like I'm in a nightmare.
Well, that's like the peak of the fantasy of the movie. He just defeated all these evil demons and sect leaders and everything, and essentially saved Manny or saved her honor or whatever, and she appears in his car, and he's hallucinating this probably, while driving and speeding through the woods.
Or maybe he was taken to another plane, because the final shot, it just shows...
I kind of wondered if she came back from
I mean, if you're gonna immerse yourself in this wild, fantastical experience, I mean, there is a lot of those themes, you know. Go back and save, you know, the woman who was taken, you know. So maybe now he has transcended this hell earth, and now he's driving in with the woman he loves.
That's a great transition into Nick Cage's performance. Sean, did you like it?
He was wonderful. Again, I love Nick Cage because you get this from him. You know, people love to just act like they ironically love Nick Cage and, like, you know, it's a joke. Nick Cage is incredible. He's one of the rawest actors you'll ever get, and because of that, you know, you find him just being the butt of jokes. An incredible performance. I love seeing Nick Cage and everything, and you get full Nick Cage in this movie.
It feels like the role was written for him.
Well, I think part of what makes him such a great performer, that no matter the emotion going on, even if it is anger, there's always that bit of vulnerability, right? Even when he's mad as hell and he looks like he could like bulldoze through anything, there's something about it that is like you're seeing into actually Nick Cage, you know. This vulnerability opens up in that moment.
Because he's a total hard ass, but he just looks like everyone's dad. I remember thinking that growing up. I'm like, Nick Cage just looks like my dad. But he's always really intense, and he has that intimidation and that compelling intimidation of just a madman.
What you were saying earlier about Red's character maybe going down some path that prevented him from drinking more, prevented him from doing whatever his old life used to be. Maybe it was violence or drugs or something. I feel like he built that house, and the fact that their bedroom is in a glass-encased little room out in the woods from their house, and one side of their house is all windows just framed together and had just a ton of light coming in. I feel like that was probably a call towards his character of being more open, more vulnerable. That's kind of how he prefers to live going forward. So that when he does make that transition to a revenge killer, you know, it's all the more significant.
I think the pivotal scene in which you really start seeing Cage turn, and you really start seeing, I think the Cage that a lot of people signed up to see, is just after he comes out of escaping from whatever way that he was tied down, going into his house, and he goes to get the liquor, right? And you had mentioned it before. It's like he goes into extremely raw, visceral, scary place, and in any other movie you'd be like, what the hell is he doing, just screaming? But in that moment it felt totally and completely appropriate, and to me the most appropriate way to use Nick Cage. To kind of piggyback off what you were saying, it was the first scene that felt like it was on a set. It
was very closed in. Everything else seemed very open, and you looked like you were in a cabin in the woods, and even Mandy said, oh, this is our home, we don't want to leave. And that seemed like you were enclosed in a box.
It was almost like the cave in like the hero's journey, right? It's like he had to go in there and find that other part of himself and come out.
Was he trying to like hold his throat open when he was guzzling the liquor?
Yeah, it was like it was burning him or something. Yeah.
So I think that kind of just indicated it's either something he doesn't do often or anymore. So what about the Goblin commercial that was on the TV?
You're the worst.
Fine, you do it.
I love the Cheddar Goblin. I mean, for obvious reasons. I think it's hilarious. It took me by complete surprise first to see the Cheddar Goblin, and then to see what the Cheddar Goblin did. Because you see this guy, and I'm laughing my ass off at this time, and then he just starts vomiting cheddar mac and cheese all over.
A lot of it.
A lot. Well, I mean, how much more cheddar does the Cheddar Goblin have?
Twice as much.
Yeah, over leading friends. I thought it was hilarious, but it also kind of was, you know, what would you say, sad to see it in the context?
Yeah, we just talked about that off screen. Like, something about the juxtaposition of something horribly tragic happening to you, and then immediately having to interact with something that's every day. You had mentioned that it's like a reminder that the world just keeps going. The TV won't just turn off because it needs to respect the reverence of the moment. It's like, no, you walk in and a cheesy commercial is just going to be playing even though you're devastated.
Yeah, and it's going to, in a way, kind of brought him, I think, back to reality. He realizes, you know, what's happened.
To the children. With mac and cheese on it.
No, because he comes into the house and he picks up Mandy's shirt. It's his shirt, but it was the last thing she was wearing before she was killed. You know, it's like a, what do they call that in like fantasy novels, you know, the woman gives like a favor or something,
like a relic,
gives her sometimes a sock, but it still has her essence, you know, so he uses it, you know, as a, like I said, like a, you know,
like a relic of something past.
Right, put that on and it gives you strength.
While the Cheddar Goblin, I thought we were just going to talk about how funny it was, but while the Cheddar Goblin does do a good job of juxtaposing those two things, right, and making it, for me, it's like I identified more with him because he walked into a room with the TV on.
He watches commercials like anyone else.
It also, for me as an audience member, like, did a little bit to bite the sadness because it was super dreadful what happened, and then to see these kids just start getting drenched with mac and cheese. It was
mac and cheese vomit.
Oh yeah.
And it's cool too because it's a little bit of world building as well. Because you see it in the trailer in the movie, not for the movie. You see it on the shelves. There's Cheddar Goblin. One of the things that I did tell myself would take me out of this film would just be too much silly humor, which I don't appreciate because it was a very serious movie, but it wasn't necessarily lighthearted as much as there were funny things in the film. It didn't become a lighthearted movie, and it didn't become so silly that you're like, okay, well now we're just off the rails. You know, certain movies will do this.
Well, the humor fit in, like, it was humorous for us, but in the context of like the world, the things that were funny made sense. Like Nick Cage was on a delusional bloodlust, so when he like snapped that person's neck and turns around smiling, like, yeah, because he's on a bloodlust, like he couldn't wait to kill this guy,
like berserker mode.
But I'm watching it, and that's a hilarious moment, and it was contextualized perfectly because it was also an over-the-top, like, demonic fight scene.
Yeah, I think anyone else doing that, it would have just became very hokey, but it just speaks to everything in this film working together. You know, you've got Nicolas Cage, who's perfect. How about that burning scene, though?
It's great.
Can we just speak on that? Just throwing her over the swing set? Seeing that guy have to struggle with her fighting and just the joy and just bliss they all kind of took from setting this chick on fire.
And it was all because she laughed at the cult leader.
Well, it didn't work. It didn't work because they gave her the good stuff, right? And the cherry on top. She was supposed to be like in it. This was supposed to work.
She's out. Yeah.
And she just is enjoying the trip. You sang this song? Yeah. And it's about you. I just want to make sure because this seems really, I'm really high and this seems really absurd. And then when it's verified and she's like, okay, well, this is hilarious. You are a joke.
That performance sold it too. He was
so good.
He was so evil, but he was so pathetic, and you hated him, but it was still easy to laugh at him,
and it was believable just to see this slideshow of emotions from this guy, and him not really believing it, but having to, and just having this this fight with himself and his people of just trying to keep control and even convince himself.
But if you ever listen to like any sort of writing or interviews with people who have led cults, they're like that. They carry a lot of self-doubt, and they do have to continually convince themselves of the delusion that they fell into. And so like that performance did carry this weight of like, this guy's in over his head and he leads all this evil crap going on.
Loved it.
Yeah.
It's perfect. Is this a perfect film?
I think so. We discussed some of our favorite scenes and moments in the movie. Maybe comment below what was your favorite kill or scene from the movie, Mandy?
Yeah, let us know. Do one of these below. Also do one of these and subscribe.
Click clack.
What are you doing?
Clicky clack. Thank you guys very much for joining us. And if you like what you're seeing, if you like movies the way that we do, please subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.